So thanks everyone for coming this morning. When I talk on Stoicism versus Buddhism, I'm going to throw a few quotes out there first. So you've got to guess, is it a Stoic quote or is it a Buddhist quote? If something can be done, what's the use of being unhappy? If nothing can be done, what good is it to be unhappy? Buddhist? Yeah, Buddhist, well done. Right. So, okay, next one then. If it's not right, do not do it. If it's not true, do not say it. Yeah, good man. Name the author. Yeah, Marcus Aurelius, Stoicism. Okay, good. All right. Well, let's. So we'll start this talk. So even from those couple of quotes, you can see there's a lot of similarities, I guess, between Stoicism and Buddhism. I'm giving this talk partly because a friend of mine in our Sangha, actually Andy, was mentioning how there's a lot of interest in Stoicism nowadays, particularly with apparently young guys and so on. And then my background, actually, I 30-something years ago, before I started practicing Buddhism, I started at university doing a philosophy degree, and actually did ancient Greek philosophy for 3 years when I was there, and my dissertation was on Plato's theories of the immortality of the soul. And in some ways, ancient Greek philosophy, a little bit of Stoicism, I was more into Plato and so on. But in some ways, that started my journey to becoming a Buddhist, actually. So I thought, oh, right, Stoicism, that's interesting. People are interested in it. So I thought maybe I could give a talk on it and see who would be interested. And I guess quite a few people are interested in Stoicism and so on. So what I was going to do in terms of format, Sam, Daniela, hello. And young, he's a bit young, isn't he, Leo, to take this in, but he's welcome to listen in. So what I was going to do is maybe give a bit more historical context on Stoicism and Buddhism, and then get stuck into more, similarities and differences. If people have got questions and stuff as we go, please chime in, and we'll see how we get on. So I did do a timeline, for context, which I think all of you have, or nearly all of you have. So some ways the timeline's very similar, but obviously you can imagine Lord Buddha was born in ancient India, Lumbini in northern Nepal today, but taught in northern India. And a sort of very similar time, you had the ancient Greek civilization and the pre-Socratics, then Plato and Aristotle in a very similar period. So if you look on this timeline, you have in front of you, Lord Buddha was born around 560 BC. And then the pre-Socratics, like Heraclitus and so on, a sort of similar time. And then Plato, who was one of the most famous ancient Greek philosophers, lived at 428. So maybe I'll run through maybe the Stoic timeline first. So there was hundreds of years of the pre-Socratics thinkers and so on. So I guess ancient Greece was such a rich, very sophisticated society. And there was a lot of focus on, more refined aspects of life, I guess, and particularly in terms of philosophy. So I think all of us, I think most of us here are Westerners. Western civilization was really, a lot of our thoughts, our values, our beliefs, really do stem from ancient Greece, and as you'll see, then ancient Rome, and so on. So maybe just look at timeline. So, Plato, 428 BC. Zeno of Citium is meant to be the founder of Stoicism. And he lived around 334 BC. And then you'll see Seneca, who was a politician but a Stoic, around the time of Christ. Epictetus 50 CE, and Marcus Aurelius 121 BC. And in some ways, I've did this timeline with the three main Stoic thinkers that people talk about nowadays. So there's obviously this resurgence in interest in Stoicism. The main people they quote are Marcus Aurelius. He was actually the emperor of the Roman Empire, so quite a big cheese, back in the day. And he was a Stoic. He wasn't a philosopher, and he wasn't. He had some education and training, but he wasn't like a Stoic philosopher. He didn't write big books. What he did do is he wrote a personal diary, really, where he put down his thoughts, a lot of those reflections on Stoicism and the situations he was in. And that book, that's collected as his meditations. And today people seem to quote that a lot. So he's very influential. And maybe partly because he was not a philosopher. He wasn't a formal, scholar. So a lot of his thoughts are very practical, because he was dealing with, ruling an empire, dealing with lots of different people in the court, dealing with a lot of conflicts and wars. So, so a lot of this stuff is very practical and pragmatic sort of advice and reflections on dealing with life and the difficult situations he was dealing with. So that seems to resonate a lot with a lot of people nowadays. Epictetus was another person very influential. He also has a full work which we have called the Discourses, which is a collection of his teachings, I think written down by one of his students. And he was actually born a slave, and then he became a free man. And then at some point, though, he served in the court of the emperor for a period of time, but then apparently was banished from the Roman Empire. And then he set up his own school of Stoicism. So again, there's quite a large collection of his teachings, which again people quote a lot. So those two, in terms of modern Stoicism, seem to be the two people quote the most. And Seneca before him, actually, he's the one that there's actually more sources of what Stoicism really was in terms of the original philosophy and more details on that. But Seneca himself wasn't a philosopher. He was actually a politician, but also quite a prolific writer, again serving in the what do you call the court of the emperor? I don't know. In the court of the emperor in the Roman Empire. So a lot of what we think about today in Stoicism comes from those three, but particularly Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus. But you'll see here that obviously before that, Zeno of Citium and the early Stoics was ancient Greece. Then Athens was sacked around just before the time of Christ, but then it was adopted in the Roman Empire in the courts of the Roman emperors. So that's where it became then more famous. So that's all where it comes from. So it's interesting. Then if in a way, then I've got a blank period of time after Marcus Aurelius. And if you look at the timeline above, I sort of mentioned that, because Marcus Aurelius was himself interested in philosophy and the focus on virtue and developing wisdom and so on, he actually reinstated the four main schools of philosophy back into Athens around 176 Christian era. And Stoicism was one of those four schools that he reinstated, which partly reflected its status in ancient Athens as well, that Stoicism was one of the main, or became one of the main philosophical systems and that people followed in Athens. But if you look at the timeline, though reinstalled 176 CE, by the time around 300 CE, it largely disappeared as an independent school of philosophy. So really, there's no no clear following or a stream of works by philosophers about Stoicism from around 300 CE. Now, one of the things that partly reflects, which we'll talk about differences later, is that, so Stoicism, modern Stoicism, in a way, is people picking up the works of some of the great Stoic philosophers, but then also these two more, maybe more accessible works of Marcus Aurelius. And then there's this modern interest in it. The Buddhist timeline, which I'll run through now, is a bit different because Buddhism is more of a living tradition. So the way we practice Buddhism is more the teachings of Lord Buddha from around 500 BC have been passed down from teacher to student in a sort of unbroken lineage since that time. So, so when like myself, others, we want to get interested in Buddhism, you find a teacher who will then sort of guide you through it. Because the idea in Buddhism is not just the transmission of the words, like all the words, the teachings of the Buddha, and then the teachings written by different masters since the Buddha, but it's also how do you understand the words and how do you apply them in your everyday life. So as I said, we often talk about the Dharma of Scripture, the teachings of Buddha in terms of Scripture, but also the Dharma of realization, or the Dharma of sort of, you might say, practiced understanding and knowledge and experience of how to put those teachings into practice in our life. So although we've got the two timelines here, so separately, they're sort of a little bit different because in a way, the Stoic timeline, it was sort of a lived tradition for a number of hundred years in ancient Greece and then ancient Rome, but then it went quiet. And then in a way, then it's rediscovery of some of those works. And then in a way, so there's a more of a modern Stoic way of life or interpretation, which is being sort of created in the last sort of 20, 30 years with the resurgence of interest in Stoicism. So that's a bit of difference early on between the two things. But then the Buddhist timeline, are just particularly some people here are Buddhists, some are not. But, for the Buddhists in the room, so there's Lord Buddha, and then there were the different schools of Buddhism that established after he passed. Buddhism was actually originally just an oral tradition. So Lord Buddha actually didn't write any books or any works or anything like that. He just taught in response to the direct questions of people. And it was after he passed, many years later, that and back then people could memorize things as well. So people would memorize his discourses, what he told people, and the key teachings that he gave. And then it was sort of 100 years later when people then actually wrote it down. And again, the works of the Lord Buddha, because he spoke in response to questions from individuals, his teachings were very, very varied. Because we as individuals, we're all very different. And we have different situations, different backgrounds and so on. So we'd always teach in response to the needs of the individual and where they're coming from and what was useful to them. So in some ways, if you look at the actual original sources of Lord Buddha's teachings, which were written down, it's often referred to as the 84,000 teachings of Lord Buddha. And there's sort of three main collections. The collections on the sutras, the discourses, which are the antidote to anger, and the teachings on meditation. There's the teachings on Vinaya, or moral discipline, which are the antidote to desire. And then the teachings on Abhidharma, or philosophy, which are the teachings on philosophy and the nature of reality. But those three buckets or baskets, as we call them, they were sort of categorized after he passed, where people tried to pull those teachings together and put them in more categories that you could sort of meaningfully look at. And then what happened over the many hundreds of years, or 2,500 years since, is different individuals, different Buddhist masters in this sort of transmission, oral transmission from teachers to students over those many, many years. You can imagine it branched off into lots of different schools because it's a person-to-person transmission. And then different masters would then emphasize different teachings of the original Buddha, bring those teachings together into more systematic presentations of what Lord Buddha was saying. And so, like in Tibetan Buddhism, generally speaking, we rarely, although they're quoted, we rarely study directly the teachings of the Buddha himself. They're quoted and see snippets, but generally we work off what we call the Shastras, the systematic presentations of Lord Buddha, which were written after the time of the Buddha. So the names we have here in the Buddhist timeline reflect some of those great masters of the Buddhist tradition. And so when we approach Buddhism, again, it's a lived transmission. So we hear the teachings, but the way that it works in Buddhism as well, you sort of test the veracity or the truth of the teachings by trying to put it into practice, and test out is it true or not. So the Buddhist timeline, I'll just sort of go through that quickly. So Nagarjuna was a great master in around 200 BC, and the works of Nagarjuna, including his letter to a friend, are studied in all the Tibetan Buddhist monasteries today. And in fact, Lama Jampa taught this here over 3 years, a few years back. So again, for a Buddhist practitioner, we study and put these teachings into practice today. A Sangha around 300 BC as well. Chandrakirti Shantadeva around 700 BC. Again, Shantadeva, his works are studied today in all the major monasteries globally in Tibetan Buddhism. Actually, this summer I was in France, received half of the teaching with a commentary from Lama Jampa on the Bodhisattva Charvatara, which was Shantadeva's main work this summer. So these are very much still lived transmissions. And then King Trizon Detsen was the sort of founder of Buddhism, or who converted Tibet to Buddhism, you might say, with some help. He was around 740 BC, AD, CE, so similar to time to Shantadeva. And then I've added on here the main transmission of the latter diffusion of Buddhism into Tibet around 10th, 11th century. So Atisha, Marpa, and Kern Kuntra Jalpo, you'll see there. So, and then we today, like this school, for those people new here, some people are new, I think. So this is Sakya Buddhist temple. So we follow the Sakya tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. It's one of the 4 main traditions. And you'll see here, so the founder of that, Kern Koncho Jalpo, was 1034, 1102. And so since then, the Sakya tradition in a way is the person-to-person transmission since that down to here today. And then similarly, my main teachers, Lama Jampa and others, Karma Kagyu, they also masters of Karma Kagyu, and Marpa was the founder of that. But you'll see, so Tibetan Buddhism, I guess one point here is that we call it Tibetan Buddhism, but it's basically the transmission that went through Tibet. But all the teachings actually came from India and directly back to the Buddha himself. So there you go. That's a bit of history and context. But you can sort of see Stoicism and Buddhism, the originating date is pretty similar. And there's, in academics, there's quite a lot of discussion about how much did ancient Greece, was it influenced by ancient Indian religions and vice versa. I'm not an expert on that, but certainly later on, Buddhism did spread as far as the Middle East through Afghanistan and into Iran and so on. So we got very close. And then a lot of the Buddhist statue styles were very influenced by ancient Greek sculpture and statues. So you do see this, particularly off the back of Alexander the Great and his empire, there was definitely overlap. And also Zeus, who is the ancient Greek god, and the Stoics, in a way they call the divinity of the universe, Zeus. Zeus is often depicted as holding a thunderbolt, and people generally think that's because it's the same god in pretty much as Indra, the ancient Vedic Indian god, who also covered a Vajra, which is a symbol of a thunderbolt. And in Buddhism, especially Vajrayana, the Vajra bell, which you'll see Vajra bell in there. So one of the main symbols of the Vajrayana, the indestructible vehicle, is the Vajra, symbolizing the indestructibility of the nature of reality of emptiness. So anyway, so you do get this. There's definitely, some mixing up, I guess, going on back to sort of 500 BC in that period of time. Okay, so there's so a little bit of background. Now I'll go through a little bit on some ideas in Stoicism to give people an idea about it. There may be people here that have read more than me about it, so forgive me if I'm a little bit simplistic in my approach. But there's three main aspects to sort of Stoic thought. There's ethics, there's physics, which includes metaphysics, understanding of the nature of the world, and then they were very strong on logic as well, and they developed quite formal forms of propositional logic, which is quite similar to modern day propositional logic, and they're very sophisticated in logic. I'd say today, and when you read things or look at YouTube, I'd say the emphasis is very much on the ethics side of things. But I'll give a brief account. I'll give a brief account of physics and logic as well. So on the ethics side, one of the key themes which we'll talk more about is the emphasis on virtue. So Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus and so on, a lot of the emphasis is on, how should we live our life? What is a meaning? How do we get meaning and live a meaningful life? And the answer really is on virtue, the practice of virtue. And we'll see in the definition of virtue, in a way the Stoics took, was very similar to the Platonic, Plato's definition of virtue. And so there's generally four aspects around that. So there's wisdom, insight into the nature of the universe, which in the Stoic world, as we see, there's a notion of the natural order, and there's a divinity and a sort of intention behind it, which is rational in nature. So rationality is sort of synonymous with wisdom. And so to practice virtue, you want to cultivate wisdom, insight into the natural way of the world, as it were. Then there's a notion of justice. And justice generally is associated with a recognition that humans, we're social animals, we live in communities. So how do we foster harmony in society? In a way that, again, there's a notion that harmony, if it's harmonious, then in a way it's in line with, it's going with the natural order of things, which should be, in their natural state, should be harmonious in nature. So justice supports the notion of how do we foster harmony in society. The third aspect of virtue is temperament or self-control. To act, know how to act in the world and with others, we need to be able to control our own emotions in order to act skillfully and to recognize the needs of others and so on. So that sort of ability to restrain oneself, to not just be dominated by the gross emotions and act mindlessly. The ability for self-control and reflection was the third of the virtues. And then the fourth one is courage. So the courage to do what is right, the courage to go with what is right and true, and not get wrapped up in the pressures, peer pressures, societal pressures to do what someone else wants you to do, which may go against what is actually virtuous. So that's briefly the notion of virtue in Stoicism, like I say, which is really common with Plato and some of the other great thinkers of ancient Greece. But Plato, one of the things he emphasized as well, and in his dialogues where he wrote his teacher Socrates, was that there's a contrast to how the Stoics and Plato thought about virtue versus what they call the Sophists as well. So the Sophists are really teachers who taught logic and reason, but their idea was that you use rationality to get ahead in life. You want to get money, you want power, you use reason and sophistry and words and manipulation in a way to get stuff, So that's all the sophist attitude. So in a way, with with Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics, in a way, there's a notion, actually, no, that's not right, that's not good. Actually, the pursuit of virtue for its own sake is what is meaningful in life. We shouldn't use virtue for some end of getting the stuff we want. No, there is actual value in being virtuous. So if we want to be happy, if we want to have meaning, if we want to be strong, then it's the conviction to follow through on what is right and what is virtuous, even if it means encountering difficulties. That is how we actually should pursue our life and what is important in our life. So maybe that's a little bit segue, a little bit, again, we'll go into a bit more detail in a bit, but it's a bit of a segue into understanding of the nature of reality. So one aspect is the Stoics' view, well, why practice virtue? And in a way, it's the Stoics, they did not, in their philosophy, the understanding of metaphysics or the world, they did not believe in reincarnation. So unlike Plato and others who thought the practice of virtue is important both for this life but also for future lives. So like Plato had the notion of the soul, and virtue is about discovering wisdom, developing wisdom, insights into nature, reality. And in a way, the pursuit of wisdom, the pursuit of reality is itself virtuous, and the soul on its positive trajectory, you'd be reborn in a situation, you get closer and closer to the truth and ultimately find complete wisdom or truth of the eternal forms, the nature, the reality of itself. The Stoics were a bit different. So they didn't believe that there's a transmigration of the soul or there was a truly existent self. Their view was more that everything is matter. Now, I say everything's matter, and I read stuff and some of the commentaries say everything's matter. When you read a bit more, I'm not sure it's quite the same as what we would think nowadays is matter. It seemed a bit more of a sophisticated view, because their notion of matter and the universe, the cosmic universe, the physical world, physical universe, they also had there is a sense of divinity to it. And there was a sense also of the rational order. There's something divine in the patterns that we see in the universe, and also the cyclical patterns of the way that reality works. There's something divine about it. And they came up with this concept of pneuma as well. So they thought everything was, the four main elements, but they also came up with the notion of how those four elements come together to comprise our physical body, this notion of spirit or soul, our impulses. And then for them, the most important aspect, three aspects of our being, is mind, which they really equate to rationality. So the Stoics really thought what is unique about humans and what is divine about us, and which is reflective of the universe, is the ability to rationalize. And there's something beautiful about logic and maths and that structure, and the way our ability to think in those rational terms is a reflection of some transcendental nature of the universe itself, which itself is structured and ordered, and there's some sort of divine presence. They sometimes call it Zeus and so on, but it doesn't sound like a sort of individual God the same way as we with Judeo-Christian God. But there's something divine about the physical, and it seems a little bit more subtle than like modern day notions of scientism. There's faith in science as if that's true, and there's just sort of gross matter. It does seem a bit more subtle than that. But essentially, though, simplistic terms, everything's matter. But they weren't atomistic. So again, even the notion of the atom in modern science has got a lot more subtle with quantum theory and so on. But they rejected the idea of atoms as truly existent, that there's building blocks to the physical world. And there's the other Zeno's paradoxes that explain why that is problematic and contradictory to believe there are truly existent atoms. But essentially they believed everything was infinitely divisible and therefore continuum. And in that vein, they followed the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus. He is a very influential philosopher. Again, we only got fragments of what he said, not a lot, but one of his famous quotes is that you never step into the same stream twice. The nature of reality is like a stream. you sort of think it's a stream and you walk into it, but the stream is always flowing, it's constantly changing, so you never step into the same stream twice, and that's an analogy for reality itself. And so the Stoics believe that notion that everything is flow, everything's in flux, and so on. There's not even an atom which is truly existent in that sense. And we'll talk more about it, but obviously, as we talk about Buddhist philosophy, there's some similarities there. But then this view, some of the debates in ancient Greece and is relevant today, though, is and Marcus Aurelius didn't like this either. Some of the consequences, though, if you think everything is rational, ordered, and matter, as you get determinism, then in a way everything is predetermined because everything is physical causes and conditions, and therefore there's an illusion of free will because actually all there really is matter. And therefore, though you have illusion of choice, actually you're just part of this natural order of the physical universe doing its thing. And so actually we're sort of blind chunks of matter, which is very much similar to modern day scientism in a way, the notion everything's matter and that somehow the theories of science explain the nature of reality. So against the Stoics in a way, which probably maybe why partly is quite easier to adopt, because it doesn't have a similar, Plato is quite different as well, but it's not so Judeo-Christian, there's a God type, monotheistic God to worship. And, it is the emphasis on I think, physicality, everything is matter, is probably easier to resonate. But you do have this problem then with determinism. How do you explain them? So what's the point of doing anything? So that's partly Marcus Aurelius. He wasn't a philosopher, but you can sort of see why he probably thought, I'm not sure I agree with all the Stoic, everything's matter and predetermined, because then what's the point of doing stuff? And where does free will enter it? So a lot of the Stoic thoughts about strength of character, strength of mind, determination to follow virtue, they sit quite awkwardly in my mind about, the physical theories they had in ancient Stoicism. Anyway, so that's a bit of an overview. Ethics, the four main pillars of virtue, the physical understanding, and then logic I won't go into, but they were very great logicians. And they developed some very sophisticated forms of formal logic, and which to me, I studied formal logic at university for 3 years and propositional logic, and these guys are really sophisticated. But I found logic, and I did quite a bit of maths as well, but it's a bit abstract. And what you see in the Stoic philosophical debates as well is that some of the Stoics thought there was some people are going far too far down the logic route, and it has a place. It doesn't really help much with living your life. So on the one hand, those Stoics, very famous, including in ancient Greece, about their logic. Within the Stoicism, there was a group of Stoics that thought, the ethics and how you live your life is more important. Bit of reason's good, but don't get carried away. Some went really far down the route of very, very sophisticated logical theories and formula. So yes, that's a bit of an overview of Stoicism. So Buddhism, so maybe an overview of Buddhism. I think many people here know quite a bit already, but I will just try and summarize Buddhism. So I've touched on it already. Obviously, all Buddhism comes from the historical Buddha 2,500 years ago. For all the Mahayana traditions of Buddhism, Tibetan, Chinese, Japanese, we don't see the historical Buddha as a unique person. We actually see the historical Buddha as the fourth of the 1,000 Buddhas of this eon. And the Buddhas manifest at different times when there's beings to be trained who are interested in and have enough accumulation of virtue that they want to know the nature of reality, and they have an inclination to practice virtue, actually. So the way Buddhas pop up from time to time, and so it gets a bit cosmic, you might say, but from a Mahayana point of view, when all the teachings of Buddhism have passed away in this eon, there'll be a period of darkness, as it were, where there aren't any Buddhists, and then another Buddha will manifest when the causes and conditions are right, and there's new people to be trained in Buddhism. So that's all quite And if you want to come to Saturday classes, we talk about this in a lot more detail with more time. But anyway, everything comes to Lord Buddha and his teachings. In Buddhism, the way we think about how to train in Buddhism and how we think about it, there's three main things we would focus on, which are training in moral discipline, ethics, again similar to the first pillar of Stoicism, you might say, training in meditation, which is a bit different, and then the third training is training in wisdom. So again, you can sort of see some similarities, but the three trainings, which you'll see in Nagarjuna's works and repeated in a lot of the main Tibetan works, the three trainings, if you want to practice Buddhism, are the foundation of ethical discipline and behavior, and then meditation, and then wisdom. And I guess that's one of the core differences with Stoicism, which we'll talk more about, is the role of meditation in the Buddhist tradition. So in Stoicism, obviously we call Marcus Aurelius collected diary and works his meditations, and often if you look at Christian thoughts as well, if you look at the monastics who study Christianity properly, they talk about meditation, deep in contemplation. And so often the Stoic and probably the Western notion of meditation is mainly focused on conceptual, analytical meditation, thinking about the nature of things, using words and concepts to examine what is true, what is not true. The use of logic to explain, if this is true, then that is true and that is false, rationality and so on. But in Buddhism, we also have analytical meditation, but there's also a strong emphasis on non-conceptual meditation and a whole world of different techniques whereby we more learn to sit and look directly into the nature of mind itself and the nature of all our experience in a non-conceptual way. So in a way, cutting through or letting go of all the conceptual thoughts and trying to look at what's underneath. And also what's the pattern of why do I get these thoughts? Where do they come from? Why do I feel certain things? Why do I have these perceptions? Where do my associations around things? What sort of patterns in my own mind? And where do they come from? So there's sort of these non-conceptual techniques as well, which in Buddhism you see is essential to really develop wisdom. You need the stability of mind and the ability to settle the mind in a way, in a non-conceptual thought, which gives you the space to examine thoughts themselves and where they come from, and then the nature of thoughts itself. So that's the second training. And then the third training in wisdom is different from the Stoic notion of virtue and wisdom. So in Stoicism, wisdom, I mentioned, it's about rationality. And there's a belief in Stoicism there is a truly real natural order. There's a rational, transcendent basis for reality, and it's rational in nature. In Buddhism, we don't think of it like that. So in Buddhism, we also have formal logic, and we use reason is essential, but it's also, you need direct, non-conceptual, non-dual, direct experience of the world, and then use logic on top of it. Otherwise, because if you only want to study formal logic, the basic thing about logic is you have some axioms, some basic truths, and then you can use logic to say, well, if this is true, what follows from that truth? So if, I should come up with an example, I haven't thought of any. If all humans are mammals, then all humans are born through giving birth and not from eggs. I don't know. It's a really bad example, so I should have prepared one earlier. But you basically, you make an observation about the world, or a few observations, and then you can draw inferential conclusions from that using logic. In Buddhism, we agree with that, but what do you take as the base truths about the world? And in Buddhism, there's this notion that in a way, we're so what's the word? Our being, our very being, is so inscribed onto us through our socialization and being born in a particular time and place, some parents, the social society. We're born all these values and belief systems which sort of permeate everything we are. And so if our experience is then through that lens, through that paradigm that we're brought up into. So if you take things at face value, that may not be true. And you'll see some of this in Stoicism, actually. But Buddhism, well, how do you really get to those basic premises which you could be confident on? You need meditation and direct experiential understanding of nature reality. So that's why you meditation to come up with some of the base foundational blocks to develop wisdom. But then you use wisdom and rationality to then draw your conclusions on what that means for how we live our life and how we interpret the world around us. So there's a bit of a subtle difference then in terms of wisdom. Now, the other aspects of Buddhism I'll touch on, but can't go into detail, is, in Buddhism, there's three main... Oh, gosh, look at the time. Yeah, in Buddhism, there's three main schools of Buddhism, systems of practice in Buddhism. The Hinayana, the lesser vehicle, the Mahayana, the great vehicle, and the Vajrayana, the indestructible vehicle. In Tibetan Buddhism, we practice all three vehicles in a sort of coherent way. In the Hinayana teachings, like the foundation, the Mahayana teachings build on the wish for personal happiness and freedom from suffering, and go into for a Mahayana Buddhist, which all Tibetan Buddhists are, actually the purpose of our life and the vows we take are, we will work for this life and all future lives in order to free all beings from suffering. So that's Mahayana Buddhism. And then Vajrayana Buddhism is part of Mahayana, so the same motivation, same understanding of the nature of reality. But in Vajrayana Buddhism, we have the particularly subtle, profound teachings of the Vajrayana, the teachings of the Buddhist Tantras, which are more powerful meditation techniques to then transform our experience and mind to more directly recognize the nature of reality in our everyday life. So there's sort of three systems of practice. Now, I'll talk more shortly. We're going to explore some of the similarities and differences in Stoicism and Buddhism some more, but I'll mainly be talking through the lens of Mahayana and Hinayana Buddhism. We won't get into Vajrayana and how that's subtly different. But there is that sort of extra complexity, you might say, in Buddhism around the different systems of practice, which operate at different levels, you might say, in terms of how we experience and interact with the world. Okay, so similarities. Let's start talking about some similarities. I've touched on some already, but we'll see where we get to. So the first theme I was going to take was, and by the way, if there's any questions, so there's any questions before we move on?
You said that Hinayana was of the three, the Vajrayana, Hinayana, and Mahayana. What would you say about the Hinayana? That is the foundation?
Yeah, the Hinayana teachings are the common foundational teachings, you might say, of all the Buddhist traditions. But it includes things like the teachings on impermanence, like the certainty of death, the uncertain time of death, and it includes teachings on karma, what is it that drives the world? It's our actions that drive the world, not a god or chance. So those teachings are part of the Hinayana. The Mahayana then is far more emphasis on, actually, if you really want to be completely free from suffering, you need altruism. And it's compassion and the wish to free all beings from suffering. That's really the key to happiness and the purpose of living, really. So, the first thing, find virtue through hardship. I pulled a few quotes here from Stoicism and a few from Buddhism, maybe to show the similarities, as it were. But one of these aspects in Marcus Aurelius, he reflects on the following. And in his diary, he says, should think about this every day and think, today I'll meet people who are meddlers, ingrates, bullies, cheaters, envious, and antisocial. And all this happens, all these difficult people, because they don't know the difference between what's good and what's bad. So I guess that's one of the themes in Stoicism, is this, why expect everyone to be nice? Actually, that isn't the case at all. People are confused, they're caught up in their own disturbing emotions, their own bad habits, their own interests. And so you're going to encounter people every day who are not very nice. And why is that? Because they don't have wisdom. They don't understand good from bad, and therefore don't know how to behave. And you'll see some similarities with Buddhism. So it's a bit like, well, how can you sort of blame them? In Buddhism, you often say, how can you blame fire for burning? How do you blame people from being horrible? We're caught up in the disturbing emotions. So a very similar theme there. And then also this notion, therefore, that, which is big in Stoicism, so the difficulties that arise by encountering difficult people, as an example, you can't, actually that's the next one, isn't it? While you can't control that, you can control how you respond to that. So there's this notion that, virtue through hardship, you practice virtue when difficult things happen. So difficult things happen, how do you respond to that? That we can control. So you can you get this horrible person trying to manipulate you to doing something really bad. How do you respond to that? You respond by just staying true to virtue. Well, what's the wise thing to do? So don't go with my emotions. They're trying to whip up my emotions maybe because he's an emperor as well. So you can imagine people come to him and say, these guys are really bad. You should destroy that town. Or these guys, you should imprison that guy's scheming behind your back. You should imprison him and torture him and kill him or something. So he's probably getting a lot of this every day. He's an emperor of the Roman Empire. How do you deal with that? Well, one thing is virtue. Well, you got to practice virtue. That's the response. So wisdom, be rational. Don't act on your emotions. Have a sense of justice. What promotes harmony in society? What creates more friction and aggression, or what creates more harmony? Self-control. So have the ability to pause. Don't just react and get caught up in the negative emotions, and have the courage to make difficult decisions. So the 4 themes of Stoic virtue: difficult situations arise, focus on the virtuous response. And so training through hardship, in a way, it's the difficult situations, which is exactly how you can then cultivate virtue. If everything's really easy and that you don't have challenging situations, you don't have the opportunity to build the courage. There's nothing as easy, is it? I'll just do what I want to do anyway. So there's no difficulty. You don't have to develop self-control, because if it's all easy and you're going with flow, that's fine. So it's precisely when things are difficult, which is then it's the opportunity to develop inner strength, inner strength of character, and cultivation of virtue. And then again, the Stoics thought that virtue is its own reward. So you're not practicing virtue just because then, if I make this decision better, people like me more and they're less likely to assassinate me. Which, I guess he would have thought that. But that's not the purpose of doing it. No, the purpose of doing it is because that is the right thing to do. And that's the most important thing in our life to follow. So that's a core thing around finding virtue through hardship. So maybe I'll then flip to on the Buddhist side, a similar theme here. I've got a couple of quotes to illustrate in Buddhism how we think about it. There was a few people here this morning, so they've heard some of these ones before, but earlier today. But anyway, so from the 8 verses of mind training, which is one of the mind training teachings of Mahayana Buddhism. So these are certain teachings about how to train the mind, use hardship to train the mind. So here's a couple of verses. So when I meet a naturally base and sinful person dominated by sin and suffering, I will see them as like a precious jewel. So I'll say it again. When I meet a naturally base and sinful person dominated by sin and suffering, I will see them as like a precious jewel. So maybe I'll explain this one from a sort of a Buddhist perspective. So the situation is we're meeting someone and they're an evil person. So that they're really bad, they're horrible. They want to, destroy people, kill people, hate, whatever it is. So they're a really bad person, and they're dominated by sin and suffering. So they're just dominated by the disturbing emotions and doing all these acts of aggression, whatever that might be. Worst case, maybe there's someone that kills people. They're really not a good person. But we will see them. But it says here, I will see them as like a precious jewel. So why is that? So in the mind training teachings, this is a Mahayana teaching. So these are teachings about how do we train the mind to fulfill our Mahayana vow, the Bodhisattva vow, to achieve Buddhahood in order to free all beings from suffering. So anyone that's entered Mahayana Buddhism, you take that vow. This life, all future lives, I will dedicate myself to training my mind so I can achieve enlightenment and therefore free all beings completely from suffering. So they themselves can be no longer controlled by the disturbing emotions and ignorance about the nature of reality. So how do you train to achieve that goal? Well, one of the key things is that you need compassion for others. And how do you generate compassion to others? Well, one of the most difficult people to generate compassion towards are really bad, evil people. So your natural response, you see someone bad, is that aggression arises. This is a bad person. I want them to be locked up, go away, destroyed. But here what we're saying is actually this really bad person, it's like they're completely dominated by their own disturbing emotions, by their own aggression. They're doing all these negative actions which will lead them into incredible suffering, as well as creating suffering for others, but actually they're creating this, because in terms of teachings on karma, the root cause of suffering is bad actions. The worst disturbing emotions, anger. So they're acting on anger, and that leads to the most worst experiences, because it breeds further anger. And if you get really angry, it's a really bad place to be. The world closes in on you. The whole world seems to be your enemy. It's a hell-like situation. So these people caught up in their own disturbing emotions, their own aggression, doing all these negative things, they're actually sowing the seeds, doing all the things that will create their own future suffering. So rather than develop aggression towards them or bad, malevolent thoughts towards them, no, I can develop compassion for them on the most difficult object of compassion that I could possibly think of. So they're like a precious jewel because they're giving me such a rare opportunity to cultivate compassion for all beings. So that was one verse from the 8 verses of mind training. Maybe I'll do one more in this vein if we're going on. So another one, similar theme. When others out of jealousy treat me badly with abuse, insults and the like, I will accept their harsh words and offer others the victory. So when others out of jealousy treat me badly with abuse, insults and the like, I should accept their harsh words and offer others the victory. So again, this one is, the scenario as you see, there's this person, they're jealous of me, so being nasty to me. Maybe they're talking behind our back, maybe they're talking to our face, they're saying very unpleasant things towards us or about us. So how do we respond to that? So a normal reaction, our emotional response will be, well, you took this as a horrible person saying nasty things behind my back. I want to say nasty things about them back to them, and so on and so forth. But we know that the disturbing emotion of aggression and aggression back to them will precisely cause me to suffer further and likely then they'll react again in more aggression towards me, and you get this escalation of negative actions, and we both accumulate more and more negative karma, which results in more suffering for us in the future. So there's an opportunity here. This negative, disturbing emotion arises because of this person being jealous and nasty to me. Is an opportunity to completely purify that experience. Because from a Buddhist perspective, all unpleasant experiences arising of our own prior karma, ripening of negative actions in prior lives, ripening as a situation, this person being horrible to me, they're jealous of me, maybe I did something bad to them, I was jealous of them and did something horrible to them. So they're naturally then doing something horrible to me. So rather than do negative actions in response, which would just perpetuate my own suffering, I'll do the opposite. I'll accept their harsh words. Okay, yeah, maybe you're right, I'm not so fantastic. And offer them the victory. Yeah, you're great. So again, this is, whether we say this out loud is a different thing, but the point is we're training our mind. How do we think about the situation? So this really bad thing happens, we catch ourselves, we want to respond negatively to them. No, it's an opportunity here to train my mind, purify the negative emotions that arise in me, my aggression and stuff back to them, and then instead completely dissipate the negative situation, and therefore purify my negative karma and avoid developing negative patterns following the disturbing emotions. So whenever that's another example. So there's similarities of finding virtue through hardship. Maybe I'll pause there before we go into the next theme, in case there are any questions. Okay, next theme. Focus only on what you can control. Focus only on what you can control. So there's a quote here I've got from Epictetus, a great Stoic philosopher in the Roman times. And there was this principle of Stoicism called the dichotomy of control, where he explains the task of the philosopher is to determine what is up to us and what is not up to us. It is not what happens that's important, it is how we respond. We can always respond with virtue, courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. So I'll say it again. So the task of the philosopher is to determine what is up to us and what is not up to us. It is not always what happens that's important, it is how we respond. We can always respond with virtue. So this is a big theme in Stoicism, and Marcus Aurelius and as well, emphasize this, is that, in life, most of what happens to us, really, we don't control. We're bound up, we're born into a certain situation, we grow up a life, and things happen, and we can't control it. And the point is, if you can't control it, well, why worry about it? You can't control it. So, but what can you control? You can control, and what you're cultivating in Stoicism as well is the ability to manage your own mind and how you respond to that situation. So again, you can sort of see a theme to the last one in a way, but the way this way of thinking about it is, when anything happens and you get an emotional response, how do you respond to the situation? It's very easy in life to get frustrated. It's so unfair or whatever, or resentful. If only these people didn't have these political views, everything would be good. Or if it wasn't for this person who said this thing to me about me at work, I would have got this promotion. Or it could be any sort of situation, but it's very easy then to like get angry or frustrated or despondent, or it happens, all the time. Things happen and they're not the things that we want to happen, and we get upset. But he said, well, but if you can't control it, you can't control it. So, but you can control your mind and your one-pointed focus on virtue. So how should I respond to this difficult situation? Like maybe some of the examples we already spoke about. From a Stoic point of view, cultivate wisdom, act rationally, not with your base emotions. Act in terms of justice. What's the way of trying to get harmony with myself and the people around me, and not create more friction and conflict? How can I, in this moment, develop self-control and not be dominated by emotions and compelled to act negatively? And how can I have the strength and courage to respond in the right sort of way and do what is right in this situation? So in a way, from the Stoic, and I think it's quite a good, easy way of thinking about it. Do I control it or do I not? If I can't control it, well, why bother about it? If I can't control it, well, that's what I should focus on. How do I change my mind and do the right thing despite these difficult circumstances? So that's Stoicism. I've got one quote here from a Buddhist quote, which by Shantideva in the Bodhisattva, where he says, "What's the use of being unhappy if nothing can be done?" Oh, sorry, I missed the line, sorry. "If something can be done, what's the use of being unhappy? If nothing can be done, what good is it to be unhappy?" So I'll say it again. If something can be done, what's the use of being unhappy? If nothing can be done, what good is it to be unhappy? So, so this is a very similar theme, but, slightly different. So if something can be done, what's the use of being unhappy? So if something can be done, well, just do it. You know what I mean? Because often you can rave on, oh, it's so unfair, it's such a bad situation, blah, blah, blah. But, if you just swallow it and just do it, it's gone, you know what I mean? It's people get hung up on things and bitch and moan about things. But if you can fix it, then just fix it. All right, why did my son leave such a mess again in the kitchen? Well, and he's gone off and I've got all this washing up to do. Yeah, just let it go, just put it in the dishwasher. or maybe tell him to do it when he gets back. But there's no point getting hung up on it and going through the mind games of, God, so frustrating, I'll do it again. There's just no point being unhappy about it or dwelling on it. So it's part of a reminder, don't get hung up on things, when you just fix it, just move on, man. And then the counter to that is obviously, if you can't do anything about it, then why be unhappy? So this situation's happened at work, as an example, it's happened, isn't it? You can't do anything about it, so just let it go, move on. So again, a very similar sort of theme here, the focus on what you can control and what you can't control. Okay, next theme I got here. I do this. I think I've touched on this one a bit already, so I'll do this one quite quickly. Yeah.
So basically, Stoicism is focusing, I cannot control this, and rationalize and think about it and going on and on and on, whereas in Buddhism is just stop it, move on. Don't have to worry.
No, Stoicism is similar. If you can't, well, they didn't put it the same way, but if you can't control it, then don't worry about it. Don't why be unhappy about it. You can't do anything about it.
Yeah. But it seems that the Stoicism, based on everything that Epictetus said, it seems that, I don't know, it seems a little bit more complicated in really focusing and thinking, oh, I cannot control this. Remember, you cannot control that. You don't have control over this. On and on. Yeah. Whereas in Buddhism, it seems, don't get hung up on it. And it's just, let
Yeah,
go.
maybe.
That's it, yeah.
But I
It's
think maybe it's simpler. But I quite like the Stoic one as well. I mean, you can imagine, because like I think Seneca and that wrote about it. You can imagine with politicians as well, they'd like this stuff, because it's like, you're a politician. You want to, can you control it? Can you not control it? And then it plays into what we'll come on to a minute about managing your emotions and so on, because that itself helps you move into the rational mode and less emotional about things. If you can't control it, then in a way for the Stoic as well, it's a good way of grounding back into your rational mind, I think, rather than get caught up in the emotional whatever.
So you say that this is a very strong similarity between the two.
I mean, again, Stoicism is like, based on what I read all these quotes, I'd say yes.
Because
but like I said, it's not. But Stoicism's like I said, it's not sort of. It's not like a living tradition in the same way. So it's sort of, I can say, because there's no master Stoic of the. I guess you could ask. So you got sort of the writings, isn't it? So if Marcus Aurelius was Epictetus,
as if trying to figure out or to analyze or rationalize that we indeed have no control over certain things. It seems a conceptualization, like think about this, and whereas in Buddhism, that's
you could be right, Cecilia. I guess generally there were two Stoic traditions apparently in ancient Greece. Sometimes I heard it called large Stoicism and small Stoicism, but in the large one is a lot of this rationality and logic and reasoning. But there was another school which said, no, to your point, Stoicism, the real value is in being more like you're saying, a bit more like the Buddhist one, which is being pragmatic.
right.
A tool to just be very pragmatic to help you make decisions in life. So probably, so I think there's two schools originally of Stoicism, and I'd probably say the latter is a bit more like Buddhism, the former is probably like you say. Yeah. Okay, next one I had was always practice virtue. That's the theme. So for Marcus Aurelius, a couple of quotes here. If it's not right, do not do it. If it's not true, do not say it. So if it's not right, do not do it. If it's not true, do not say it. It's pretty clear, then. And then another quote from Marcus Aurelius. Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be one. So waste no more time arguing what a good man should be one. So, and I want to cover two more things, so I won't say too much about this one, but one other maybe example on the Buddhist side, again, Shantideva. I would rather be burned alive or have my head chopped off than bow down to the enemy disturbing emotions. So I would rather be burned alive or have my head chopped off than bow down to the enemy disturbing emotions. So I think that's pretty clear. Okay, so the next theme, meditate on death. So Stoics also think it's good to meditate on death. It's not just the Buddhists. And so key principle, memento mori, remember you must die. And then a couple of quotes here on the Stoic side. So Seneca, let us prepare our minds as if we had come to the very end of life. Let us postpone nothing. Let us balance life's books each and every day. So let us prepare our minds as if we've come to the very end of life. Let us postpone nothing. Let us balance life's books each and every day. And then a quote here from Marcus Aurelius, live life properly. You could leave your life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think. So live life properly. You could leave your life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think. So obviously there's this theme, that it's good to think about your death and that you don't know when you're going to die, so you treat every day as if it could be your last. And therefore, what's important about what you're going to do today? And for a Stoic, what's important is focus on virtue, which obviously virtue for them means, wisdom, justice, self-control, and courage. But every situation, every day, try and do as much virtue as possible and avoid sinful, negative actions. So in the Buddhist side, we've got a couple of quotes here which are taken from the 4 thoughts that turn the mind to the Dharma, and they're like a summary of 2 of the second and third I took it from Jungong Control. So first is on impermanence, on death. So the world and its inhabitants are impermanent. The life of each being is like a water bubble. It's uncertain when I will die and become a corpse. As it's only the Dharma that can help me at the time of death, I must practice now with diligence. So the world and its inhabitants are impermanent. The life of each being is like a water bubble. It's uncertain when I will die and become a corpse. And it's only the practice of Dharma that can help me at the time of death, and Dharma generally practice virtue, avoid non-virtue. I must therefore practice now with diligence. Then maybe quickly, the third of the 4 thoughts that turn the mind to Dharma. Dharma means the Buddhist teachings. At the time of death, there is no freedom, and karma takes its course. Therefore, I must watch my mind every day. At the time of death, there is no freedom, and karma takes its course. I must therefore watch my mind stream every day. So, similar theme. So, and in Buddhism, it's more, there's some analytical meditations on this, which those quotes I gave are like a high-level summary of some more formal analytical meditations we do in Buddhism called the 4 thoughts that turn the mind to Dharma, to the Buddhist teachings. And so impermanence, there's different ways, there's guidance on ways of thinking about it, but we're definitely going to die. That's thought number 1. And although it's easy to ascribe to that, no one's going to disagree. Yeah, no, I'm not. No, yeah, I think everyone would agree. But emotionally, we don't live like that. We don't act like that. We think, yeah, I'm going to die. Yeah, maybe, yeah, sometime. And then the second thought is the uncertainty of the time of death. So one, definitely going to die. You can think about everyone in history that's died, but the uncertainty of the time of death is the key thing. So, we don't know. We assume it's not today. It may be, maybe I'll retire, maybe, have my retirement and then I'll probably die, but definitely I've got a while, you just, emotionally, we don't think but it really is in the meditations on this, we really could die any moment. There are no guarantees. So Shantideva says, every time we breathe out is a miracle we breathe in again. Every time we go to bed is a miracle that we wake up in the morning. There's there are no certainties. And from a Stoic point of view, practice of virtue is what you should focus on, although they don't really emphasize what happens at the time of death. In Buddhism, we do think things happen at the time of death. So in Buddhism, it's like, we don't think of, we think there's a continuum of mind, in a sense, a big mind, which we're all part of, you could say, but each individual mind stream as well is beginningless. There was no creation. So in Stoicism, they think the world was created out of fire by the god Zeus and goes through a cycle and then destroyed, and then God will recreate the universe. In Buddhism, it's like, it's just a beginning. There was no first cause to this universe. Everything is a beginningless chain of dependent origination, and awareness of the stream of being, mind streams of beings, is part of that beginningless cycle of causation. And so at the time of death, mind doesn't disappear any more than the body disappears. The body dissolves back into the physical continuum, the mind dissolves back into the mental continuum, and then experiences re-arise as well. So the only thing from Buddhist point of view that helps us at the time of death is how much we've practiced the Dharma, how much essentially we've practiced virtue, how much we've trained the mind to do positive things and not do negative things. How much we train the mind to dissolve and let go of the disturbing emotions rather than encourage and go with the disturbing emotions like aggression and desire and so on. Okay, last similarity, and then I've got 5 minutes to talk about differences, but I've touched on some of them already. So the last one I had here was manage your perceptions or emotions. So in Stoicism, obviously there's a lot of focus on being stoic, managing your emotions. And I was going to weave in a bit more about this because I did do the old Google search on was Gladiator influenced by Stoicism for the tour. It was Gladiator, and the analysis I think Gemini AI came up with is that apparently the emperor at the beginning was killed by his son. He was based on Marcus Aurelius, and so on. But Gladiator, he was just a fictional character. But he was quite a stoic character, wasn't it? All that stuff happened to his wife and his son killed, and then he's taken a slave. He wakes up as a slave. He's lost everything, leader of the Roman legions, and now he's Maximus the slave. But he carries on. He carries on. Now, they substituted the traditional notion of virtue with the notion of the republic. Marcus Aurelius was Roman emperor. He didn't want a republic. He was the emperor of the Roman Empire. But in the film, if you remember, he said, "Oh, I answer the creeds or the republic. Maximus, you must go back to Rome." and if you remember, the thing that kept him going was partly that. He wanted to follow through on and help reestablish the republic and overthrow the evil new emperor, as it were. But so, although revenge and republics aren't really either a traditional or Buddhist notion of what virtue is, but that was sort of the substitute for he was trying to do virtue, and it helped him do what he had to do, including chopping a lot of heads off, but whatever. Anyway, but quite stoic. Anyway, managing your emotions. So now in Seneca, he had a 3-stage approach for managing emotions, which apparently was taken on by modern, what do you call it, cognitive psychology, but anyway, in the 90s. But anyway, so he said the first movement of emotion in a situation is uncontrollable. So you have an experience of life, you have a reaction and experience. You can't control that, it's just what comes up. Second point then is assent to judgment. So if you're trying to follow the path to wisdom and rationality, you pause and say, well, was that first impression correct? You have an emotional response, bad person, I want to hit them. So was that the right response? And so you can apply then rationality to that and say, do I agree or not? And then the third movement, then controlled emotion, is, okay, well, if I censor it, fine, we'll do what is right, because I think that was a correct impression and in accord with rationality. But if I don't agree with that initial impression, when I've applied reason, actually that's not the right reaction, that's not the right thing to do, then we should then control our emotions and then follow the path to virtue and do what is virtuous. In Marcus Aurelius' quote I had, it was, see vintage, in order to quell desire, see vintage wine as rotted grapes, which will cut the allure. So what is wine? Well, principle, reality is rotted grapes. So, but thinking of it like that can help cut your attachment and desire for it. So in Buddhism, I've got a couple of quotes here, and it's really caught up with mindfulness. And mindfulness has been a bit hijacked in recent times by the secular movement, but the original mindfulness in Buddhism is being mindful of our mind in order to follow through on our commitment to benefit all sentient beings. So there's a notion of remembering, well, what's the purpose of life? Practice virtue. And so we're being mindful for that reason, not in order to be less stressed or to do better in our job. It's like actually to try and do virtue is really what mindfulness is about. So 8 verses of mind training again. Examining my mind throughout all activities, as soon as a disturbing emotion arises that endangers myself and others, by facing it, I will turn it away. So examining my mind throughout all activities, as soon as a disturbing emotion like anger, desire, ignorance arises that endangers myself and others, because it may make me do a negative action, by facing it, I will turn it away. It's a similar theme, it's this notion of being mindful, being able to pause, and then alarm bells if you realize that, a bit like the Stoics, that first impression is taking me down a negative pathway. I'm getting irritated, I want to say something, no, pause, stop. And in Buddhism, there's three main ways we can respond to that. One is don't do anything, act like a piece of wood, don't do anything. Second one's to apply the remedy, like this person who's being horrible to me, it must be ripening of my negative karma. They're helping me purify my karma. I won't do anything back to them. Or the third one is to dissolve the negative emotion into the primordial wisdom of the nature of reality. It's the sort of third technique. But so anyway, that's one quote from Buddhism on how to manage our negative emotions.
Can you repeat the second one? Do nothing, be like...
The first one's act like wood. That's the quotes from Shantideva. The second one is apply the remedy. So there's lots of remedies in Buddhism on how to counter different disturbing emotions. One of them is to think about, if anything, someone's doing something negative to you, I must have done something negative to them in a prior life, and therefore it's just the ripening of that negative karma. So I'm getting my comeuppance, and in a way they're giving me the opportunity to burn off that negative karma, to purify that negative karma. If I respond negatively to it and I do another act of aggression back to their act, then I'm creating more negative karma, which will create more suffering for me now and later. So no, they're helping me cut my negative emotions and purify my mind. So I won't do anything bad back to them. Okay, so that was similarities finished. I just had a few notes here on differences. So maybe I'll just say a few things to wrap up. As well as these notes, I can email my detailed notes, which has lots of these quotes in for the Stoics and the Buddhist side. So I'll email that to everyone, the books. On the differences side, the things I had down were the nature of virtue. So I've talked about virtue in the Stoic sense in terms of wisdom, justice, self-control, and courage. But in Buddhism, it's different. In Buddhism, it's intention which determines if our actions are good or bad. And if our intentions are dominated by the disturbing emotions, such as aggression, desire, ignorance, or the other major and minor disturbing emotions like pride, or jealousy, or resentment, or rage, or even things like laziness and things like that, then that's a negative action. And the inevitable consequence will have an experience in the future, which is suffering, because that experience will be coloured by the colour of the intention we had. So if we act out of aggression, inevitably in the future that will ripen as an experience where that regression is reflected back on us. That action also ripens as an inclination to do more aggressive acts. So if we're in a situation we act aggressively, we're in a similar, and we do that, when we're in a similar situation again, same thing comes up, we're more likely to act in the same way, aggressively. Vice versa, if you're in a difficult situation, instead of lashing out with aggression, you let it go, you don't do anything, you get yourself in a similar situation again, you're less likely to lash out. So there's this patterning of mind through our actions. And so, but it's our intentions which decide if it's a good or bad action. So there's a big difference there. You know, the Stoics basically took the Platonic model of virtue and sort of ran with it. Yeah, we will have a different understanding of what virtue is, but again, there's similarities. I think the Stoic notion is probably more in line with the Judeo-Christian notion of virtue, which probably resonates and is very familiar to us as Westerners because it permeates a lot of our even secular belief system. Second one I had was how to manage emotions. So, you know, there's a lot of, and I'm not an expert on Stoicism, but a lot of it's about virtue is the main thing. So when negative emotions come up, they're a problem because they stop us being rational. And therefore you're trying to sort of get rid of the emotions, so do and follow truth, you know, wisdom, rationality. So it's a bit in Buddhism, it's like it's a different understanding of where the disturbing emotions come from, and therefore how we deal with them. So whereas in Stoicism, well, why do things happen? We're just caught up in this material universe, that things happen. It's just we're caught up in this deterministic material universe, and you can't control it, shit happens. But Buddhism, no, everything arises because of the actions of beings. everything arises to me in this life is the ripening karma from prior lives. And while I can't go back in time, I can't complain about it in a way. If negative things happen, it's the ripening of my negative karma. If good things happen, I must have done something positive. But the point in the Buddhism thing is that, therefore, you can influence the future in this life and future lives. And you don't just practice virtue purely for its own sake, as in Stoicism. You do it because that's how you're going to be happy and free from suffering in this and future lives. And that patterning we create from, when we think about the notion of rebirth in Buddhism, that while there is no soul that's reborn, it's the patterning of mind which continues, as it were. And so every time we act, either positively or negatively, we're sowing the seeds and laying new patterns in our mind, either aggressive, desirous, or generous and kind and compassionate and so on. So the more we can train in virtue in the Buddhist sense, there's a reason for it in a way, and it's all about actions and intention. And then lastly, determinism or fate. So there is this sort of determinism type notion in traditional Stoicism, but also if you really think about it with modern scientism, which accepts that everything is just matter, again, you're really caught up in this sort of deterministic thing that then our intentions, our actions, they don't really have consequences because they're just like, it's actually just a material process. There's nothing behind it. In Buddhism, we actually think it's mind which is primary. Mind is king, as Lord Buddha said, not matter. And therefore we can change our own future experience through managing our own mind and training our mind in this life. Okay, so that's it. I went 5 minutes over. It's not bad, an hour and a half talk, but maybe we can, if people want to hang out for questions, happy to stay around for a bit. If you've got to go, then that's good as well.